Where the Tides Remember Us, a quiet story of sea glass, silence, and the gentle act of staying when everything else wants to drift. The days had stretched longer, filling with more sky than I knew what to do with. Spring settled lightly over the town, brushing the cliffs and rooftops with a faded kind of warmth. The sea never changed much, though. It kept its steady rhythm, pulling away and returning, asking for nothing. I had been here for 6 months, long enough that people stopped glancing twice at me. The house I rented leaned toward the water, a little more each year. Some evenings it creaked and shifted in the wind, sounding more alive than I felt. The work I found suited me. An art supply store tucked between a fish market and a bakery. A quiet place, where the days blended together in the simple acts of stacking brushes, dusting shelves, and counting inventory that rarely changed. I liked the silence. It didn't expect anything from me. In the mornings before the shop opened, I walked to the beach. The sand was cool and damp, pressed smooth by the night. I looked for sea glass, although I rarely picked it up. It seemed better to leave it where it was, shaped by the tide into something softer. There were others who came to the beach at that hour, but only one stayed long enough to become familiar. A man, usually wrapped in a dark jacket, with a camera hanging loosely at his side. He never hurried. Some mornings he didn't even lift the camera, just stood still, looking out at the horizon. At first I didn't think much of him. People who lingered by the sea usually had something they were waiting for, or something they had given up trying to find. He came into the store on a rainy afternoon, shaking water from his sleeves. He moved slowly, as if measuring his place in the world with each step. He bought a sketchbook and a few pencils, paid in cash, and left without saying much. It became a pattern. Every few weeks, he returned, always buying small things, never staying long. I started to expect him without meaning to. The town prepared for the summer festival as the days grew warmer. Lanterns appeared above the streets. Children practiced their dances under the wide branches of the old trees. Vendors painted signs and built stalls from driftwood and nails that bent easily in the salt air. I helped when asked, tying knots, handing over nails, and sweeping sand out of corners. It wasn't much, but it filled the time between sunrise and sunset. The man with the camera appeared more often during those days, capturing scenes that most would have walked past without noticing. A broken fishing net mended with bright thread. A dog sleeping beside a fruit stall. A child chasing a paper kite that couldn't quite lift into the air. He rarely pointed the lens directly at people. It was as if he was trying to catch life at its edges, where it felt most honest. The night of the festival came heavy with humidity. The sky hung low and the sea was still, as if it too was listening. Lights flickered on in every direction, casting uneven shadows across the sand. I walked through the crowds, careful not to bump into anyone, content to observe. Music drifted from the harbor, soft and slow. The old Ferris wheel turned with a faint squeal of rusted gears. Near the bonfire I paused. People gathered in loose circles, throwing salt into the flames, a tradition meant to keep away misfortune. The fire crackled and roared, the salt hissing as it burned away. I caught sight of him again, across the crowd. This time, he wasn't behind his camera. He stood still, watching the flames, his face quiet in the flickering light. It was strange, realizing that we had shared this town for months without ever needing to exchange words. Stranger still, how much comfort that silent presence had come to hold. The fireworks started after night fully fell. Bright flowers bloomed against the darkness, their colors painting the faces turned upward. Children shrieked with delight. Couples leaned closer together. Older residents clapped slowly, smiling in a way that had nothing to do with the display itself. I stayed until the smoke grew thick and the crowd thinned. Then I turned back toward the edge of the beach, where the tide was beginning to reach higher onto the sand. The next morning I opened the store and found something tucked under the door. It was a photograph. Not posed, not perfect. Just the bonfire, burning against the dark, with a few figures caught mid-step, blurred by motion. In the corner of the frame, small and sharp against the light, was a woman standing alone. It took a few moments before I recognized myself. The photo wasn't beautiful in the way postcards were. The colors were muted, the focus was soft. But it captured something real, a kind of presence I hadn't realized I carried. A part of me that still stood upright, even after everything. I pinned the photo to the wall behind the counter, where the morning sun caught it at just the right angle. The man with the camera didn't return after that. I didn't expect him to. Maybe he had finished whatever story he had come here to tell. Or maybe he had simply decided it was enough. Summer bled into early autumn without ceremony. The air turned brittle at night, tasting faintly of wood smoke and salt. Children returned to school, and the laughter that once echoed between the narrow alleys softened into a distant hum. My walks to the beach remained unchanged, but the sea glass was harder to find. The tide, as always, gave and withheld without warning. At the shop, the days grew shorter and the light slanted in at new angles. Paints were reordered less often. The small rush of tourists that once slipped in to buy travel journals or cheap watercolors disappeared like footprints in wet sand. Still, I stayed. Still, I counted the brushes even when no one came. The photograph behind the counter became something I looked at without thinking. It was not a symbol nor a keepsake. It was a moment, preserved in its ordinariness as proof of presence. A small reminder that I had existed here, not as a shadow, but as something visible. The man with the camera never came back. I sometimes imagined he had wandered to another quiet town with his soft steps and his careful gaze. But there were mornings I could still sense him on the far edge of the shore, just out of reach, just before the sun cleared the horizon. He had vanished the way waves retreat, not with finality, but with the promise of return, written somewhere in the undertow. Life curled into a quieter shape. I began to notice the way the gulls called at different pitches, depending on the weather. I began to understand when the rain would arrive by the smell of the earth beneath the boardwalk. And I began to tend to small things like mending a frayed tablecloth, painting the frame around the shop's window, and setting out a bowl of cracked shells for no reason other than the joy of pattern and color. The townspeople greeted me more easily, not out of curiosity, but habit, the kind that comes from repetition, from presence that stays put. There was comfort in that, a rhythm built not from excitement or drama, but from stillness that didn't need explanation. Once after a storm, I found the beach strewn with driftwood and fragments of coral. A mirror had washed up, its frame split and warped by salt and sun. I carried it back to the house and set it against the porch. It didn't reflect clearly anymore. The glass had fogged and warped, but sometimes I glimpsed myself in it. Not sharp, not whole, but softened, shaped by something larger than myself. I began keeping the sea glass I found. Only the small pieces, the ones with deep hues, greens like the moss-covered rocks, blues like storm-lit water. I placed them on the windowsill where the light could pass through. Each piece is different, all made smooth by the same process: pressure, motion, and time. The house continued its slow lean toward the ocean. The wind pushed against it with more insistence, and some nights the windows rattled with the sound of stories trying to be remembered. But I stayed. I slept through the gusts. I fixed what I could, and when things broke beyond repair, I let them go. Winter arrived like an old friend, not entirely welcome but not wholly unwanted. The sea grew sharper, more metallic. Fewer boats went out, the sky folded inward, gray and unreadable. And yet there was peace in its restraint. The world seemed to hold its breath, and I held mine with it. Sometimes I lit a fire in the old stove and sat beside it with a blanket around my shoulders. The silence felt denser then, filled with unseen things. Regret, maybe, or memory, but also grace. The grace of survival without spectacle. The grace of having weathered storms no one else had noticed. The second festival came around again. This time I walked to the edge of the gathering crowd with a steadier step. The air was colder, and the bonfire was larger. Children held sparklers, and parents carried thermoses. Laughter curled around the flames, carried away by the wind. I did not stand at the outskirts. I stepped forward, letting the warmth reach me. And when the salt was passed from hand to hand, I took a pinch and threw it into the fire. It sizzled and cracked. I felt the heat on my face and the cold on my back, and I let the contrast settle over me like truth. The sea was still there, pulling away, returning, indifferent and eternal. I walked along the shoreline after the crowd dispersed. The sand was uneven beneath my boots. Somewhere beyond the dark, I knew the tide was coming in again, unseen and steady. I looked out across the horizon, and for a moment the wind shifted in a way that reminded me of him. Not the man himself, but the space he had left behind. A shape in the world that had altered mine. I returned home with a new piece of sea glass in my pocket. It was almost black, but when held up to the light, it revealed deep green threads running through it like veins or roots or paths that had no clear beginning or end. That night I set it beside the photograph. Not as an offering, but as a continuation, a small quiet marker of having stayed.